talking about display rules. So we'll pick up by looking at cognitive functions of emotions. One of the things we saw in the video about Phineas Gage is that he really lost his ability to think rationally because he lost control over his emotions. And we think emotions actually help support and underlie a lot of our cognitive processes. We certainly know emotional memory is different. So we know that decisions are often based on emotional reactions rather than cognitive processes. So this is one of the reasons why we know people don't make necessarily the most rational decisions, because oftentimes emotion underlies them. Any of you who are familiar with Dan Ariely's work, he's got a really great book called Predictably Irrational, about how we clearly do irrational things, and oftentimes these are based on emotion. Examples of those we'll talk more about after the exam on Monday. But things like we base decisions on how vivid a memory is, how impactful a memory is. So people are afraid of flying, even though the most dangerous part of flying is getting to and from the airport. But somehow plane crashes have more emotion than car crashes. We also think decisions may be based on our current emotional and physical state, and we call this the somatic marker hypothesis. That is, our current emotional, physical well-being underlies some of our decision making. So we make different kinds of decisions depending on our emotional and physical states. And I think you probably have all experienced this in some way or another, where we make different decisions because of our emotional state or because we're not feeling well. Anybody who's like me, anybody get angry when they're hungry? Yeah. We all need that t-shirt that says, "I'm sorry for what I said when I was hungry." Because I do. I get very, very hangry. So kind of have to watch out for that. We also know that emotions are wrapped up in our attentional mechanisms. That is, attentional information automatically captures our attention. We're actually geared to pay attention to highly emotional events, highly emotional experiences. There's a whole bunch of research on emotional memory and things that capture our attention automatically. I want to briefly talk about what's called the emotional Stroop task. I don't remember if we talked much about the basic Stroop task, so we'll do a quick summary. This is the traditional Stroop task, called the Stroop color naming task. And essentially what participants do is they name the color that the words are presented in. So oftentimes this is just done with a sheet of paper with words in different colors. So in this case, you have to ignore the word and focus on the color. That ignoring of the actual word is harder for some people than others. Certainly older adults have a harder time inhibiting that information. So to get through this task, you would go yellow, green, yellow, orange, green, blue, blue, yellow, blue, green, yellow, orange, etc. In the emotional Stroop task, same thing, but now we've taken it from color names to emotional words. And people are much faster, and usually you do this all at once, so it'll be all emotional words or all non-emotional words. People are much faster at naming the color of these non-emotional words than the more emotional words. So the more emotional words are here on top, and the less emotional words here on the bottom. People are much faster at identifying the colors in these non-emotional words. And the reason for that is these non-emotional words are easier to ignore. These words capture our attention automatically. In one of my research studies, we actually looked at memory for emotional words in small versus large font. And it was really remarkable. I'd be watching participants as they went through the task, and when these emotional words came up in large letters, they really stood out, like rape, murder, terrorism, like, just kind of shouting at you. So it kind of really automatically captures our attention. So naming the color takes longer for those emotional words, indicating that this automatically captures our attention. That is, our attentional mechanisms are designed to automatically capture this kind of highly emotional information. And that's a really important part of understanding why emotional events drive our cognitive processes so much because they capture our attention so much more. They are much more vivid in our memory, and they're much more likely to change the way we view things like risk. So, very first day of class, I talked about why are people afraid to live in the city? Because they're afraid of the city in ways that they're not afraid of the suburbs. Because the perceived threat of crime is so much higher than the perceived threat of dying in a car accident. Because car accidents, while they're emotional for the people that are involved in them, have become just part of what happens in our lives. Whereas somebody getting shot or stabbed has a different emotional context to it. So we overweigh that in our risk calculus. Emotion certainly plays a role in memory. Highly emotional memories tend to be our strongest, most personal memories. Memory, there's what's called the mood congruency effect. Is that here? Thought it was. Where when we're in a particular mood, we tend to remember things from that particular mood. So research has also shown that highly negative photographs are associated with more memorial detail than non-emotional photographs. So we remember those specific details better in those highly emotional photographs. And keep in mind, memory and emotion are governed by related neural structures in the limbic system. I just finished lecturing on the neuroscience of memory to my cognition class a half hour ago, and one of the things we talked about is how the amygdala interacts directly with the hypothalamus and hippocampus in ways to form highly emotional memories. And so those memories have a different quality, a different feel to them than our sort of average everyday memories. So there are some things called mood-dependent or mood-congruent memories. We tend to remember items best if our mood matches that when we studied something. What we call mood-dependent memory. The mood congruency effect is where we remember events that are congruent with our current mood. So these are two sides of the same coin. The mood-dependent memory idea is if you're studying for an exam while bitter and angry at somebody, you should probably pick a fight before the exam. Try not to do either of these things. But the mood congruency effect really has more to do with what our current mood is thinking about affecting what we remember. And one of the things that can happen is if we're, kind of down in a not very good mood, kind of in a sad mood, what happens then is we start remembering all of these sad things that happened in our life, and we can very quickly spiral. And I think probably most people have had this experience, right, where you just sort of spiral downward and dig further under the covers and deeper into the Ben and Jerry's, right? It happens. The thing is to catch yourself before you spiral too far. And it's a problem with depression is it is a spiraling problem. So when we're sad, we tend to remember events that also happened when we were sad. And that's not a good thing. So one of the things we'll talk about is distraction is an important way to try to regulate your mood. Because simply trying to ignore your mood or trying to ignore sad events from your life is not a particularly effective way to do that. So that's something to watch out for. And certainly if you know one of your friends is experiencing a time like this, try to get them out moving around, doing something. I think the gray has lifted, at least for the afternoon. So hopefully spring is starting to actually happen and we can all come out of our seasonal affective disorder. Moods help regulate our interpersonal relations. Guilt actually is an important part of our social bond. It helps strengthen social bonds when we feel guilty about how we've treated someone. Socialization is a critical part of development of appropriate interpersonal emotions. Embarrassment and blushing are ways in which we elicit forgiveness and appease others. It's a way of signaling, I feel bad about what just happened and I'm really sorry for it. And so that helps us sort of regulate our interpersonal behavior. You always, you're willing to forgive someone who runs into you, who apologizes and clearly feels embarrassed by it, versus, we've all had this happen, somebody who just plows you over and keeps going, right? Who are you more likely to chase down? It's a really important part of how we sort of regulate our social environment. Now, not everyone responds the same way. First of all, not everyone feels guilty about the same kinds of things. And not everyone responds to that kind of guilt or that kind of embarrassment. Any questions about introduction? Today's going to feel hopefully not terribly rushed, but I want to make sure we get through all of this before the exam. But please stop me if there's something you want to know more about. This is pretty straightforward. So I want to talk next about, this is where we'll spend most of today, is in understanding models of emotion, the phenomenology, how it's related to our physiology, its cognitive component, and then we'll finally finish with regulation of moods. And this is a really important part of trying to learn how to be a more happy, well-centered adult, is figuring out how to regulate your moods in appropriate ways. So we'll start with the phenomenology of emotions. And this is just basically our experience of emotions. Now remember, phenomenology is our sort of internal feelings, what it feels like on the inside. The first thing is there are people who no longer have the subjective experience of emotion, and these disorders called alexithymia. It can be due to brain disease, disorder, brain damage. One of the things that's very difficult is how do we measure someone's emotion. So if we're interested in studying emotion, we have to figure out a way to measure it. And it's not something we can take out and stick on a scale, right? So we have to do things like self-report, rate your emotional response, rate your mood. We interview people, kind of pry at their moods and what their emotional experiences and emotional reactions are. It's a difficult thing to do because not everyone's very in touch with their emotions or why they feel certain ways. I don't think that comes as a great galloping shock to anyone that not everyone is as particularly self-aware of their emotional states. This can be pretty difficult. One of the important ways in which we kind of pick apart this question is trying to figure out which are genuine kind of emotions. In order to ask someone about an emotion, we have to label them first, right? So we start with sort of what we call the primary emotions. We think these are sort of evolutionarily related or evolutionary adaptive. That are shared across cultures. Every culture has these. And they are actually associated with specific biological or physical states. So we can identify these primary emotions by their physiology as well as their experience. So these are some of the primary emotions. Fear, everyone has that. Sadness, disgust, anger, happiness, surprise, and contempt. We'll take kind of a look at this, obviously, fear. Turn this light off again. I want to say that's disgust. This is why you don't put your pictures on the internet, because people like me find them and put them in their lectures. I'm guessing that's surprise. I don't know what has just happened in this picture. We don't have much context here. That would be surprise. Surprise is, by the way, we'll talk more about this in a moment, is what we call a neutrally valent emotion. That is, it's neither good nor bad, right? It just is. Whereas, fear and sadness are negative emotions. Happiness is a positive emotion. Surprise is one of those that's right on the line. It can go either way, right? There's good surprises and bad surprises. Good surprise is somebody shows up and takes you out to dinner that you weren't expecting. Bad surprise is you have a flat tire that you weren't expecting. Or, you walk in and find your spouse with somebody else. Bad surprise. Still surprising, right? Secondary emotions are sort of blends of the primary emotions. And these are less sort of culturally found in all cultures. I don't know what word I was thinking of there. They are things like remorse, guilt, submission, and anticipation. We tend to often see them in other species. At least we think this looks like guilt to me. I've seen that look on my dog's faces before. But these kinds of blends of emotion, anticipation is kind of both surprise and a little bit, it's one of those things that has, again, is sort of doesn't have its own valence associated with it. It can be anticipating something good or something bad. We actually end up then with this kind of, this is what's called a multidimensional scaling solution, where we look at valence being highly negative or positive versus arousal. So low levels of arousal versus high levels of arousal. So in the low arousals, we have sort of sleepy versus tired, relaxed versus bored or droopy, sad versus calm. These are more negative. We're getting more into the higher arousal when we get more into the sort of actively depressed. Then in the negative high arousal, we have alarmed, afraid, angry. The high levels of positive, we have excited, delighted versus happy, etc. So this kind of multidimensional scaling solution really helps when we talk about the circumplex model of emotions here in a moment. So under this circumplex model of emotions, they're arranged in the same way that we just talked about, according to their level of arousal and their valence or pleasantness. So we talked about valence being good versus bad, and level of arousal or activation. So positive activation versus negative activation or deactivation, really. And these are associated with different physical states, different neurotransmitters, etc. So they are part of, this is a really, I think, great way of trying to understand emotion is in this kind of multidimensional way. Excuse me. So we start to understand emotions in terms of these two attributes, and really things kind of start to fall into place. So now we kind of have it looking this way. We'll get back to that in a bit. So we have more deactivation or activation. So surprise is right here on the line between unpleasant and pleasant. Excited is sort of the high level of activation, positive versus nervous. So anticipation is one of the things we were just talking about. You might be anticipating going to a vacation, going on a good trip, or you might be anticipating having surgery, and so you're more nervous about that. Basically, this kind of circumplex model really does capture a lot about what we know about emotion. So positive activation is associated with increased levels of dopamine, which is associated with reward, positive feelings. So all of these positive feelings we talked about, feeling good, seem to be associated with dopamine. Negative activation is associated with norepinephrine levels. And so this kind of, let me get back here. So positive activation over here is associated with dopamine. Negative activation, fear and anger, stress, associated with norepinephrine. So high levels of activation that feel good are associated with dopamine. High levels of activation that are bad are associated with norepinephrine. So norepinephrine, of course, is one of our primary stress hormones. Questions about that? Yeah. Now we're a whole different. Yeah, so I know this is where it starts to get confusing. So, and some of that may have been I might have misspoken. So we have activation versus deactivation, whereas over here we were talking about low and high levels of arousal. Now we're talking about positive activation. We're over here because we're in the pleasant, and then in the negative, we're over here in the unpleasant, but still up here in the more active. Does that make sense? Yeah. It took me a minute to try to figure out. I was sitting here in my head because I think I did the same thing when I was looking at that slide. I was in the negative activation. I was down here, and I thought that makes no sense why you would have more norepinephrine, but it makes perfect sense over here. Epinephrine is associated with our primal sort of fight or flight emotions, so fear, anger, all of that. Now, when we talk about things like drugs and how they affect emotions, cocaine has most of its effects over here. It has mostly dopamine effects. Amphetamines have most of their effects over here, particularly over long periods of time. And so when you have more increases in norepinephrine, so this is the opposite side of that coin, which is why I kind of wanted to get back to what you're saying. When you increase dopamine levels only, you get more of this kind of feeling. When you increase norepinephrine levels, you get more of these feelings over here. And so part of this all wraps up in things like drugs and how they affect moods and emotions. So as we start getting later into the semester, I try to start tying some of this all back in together. Does that answer your question? It's a very good question, by the way. Okay, so one of the things we know about emotions is they are associated with physiological states. And this is where we get into a bit of what we sort of call the chicken and the egg. Which comes first? Is it the physical state that causes the emotion, or does the emotion cause the change in the physical state? That's a good question. We'll start with the James-Lange theory, which posits that it's how we interpret physical changes that lead to our feelings of emotion. So we have physical changes, and our interpretation of those physical changes are what then lead to what our feeling of emotion is. So we might have some increase in activation, for example, and how we interpret it depends on what emotion we'll feel. So we might feel excited, or we might feel nervous, but the underlying physiology, according to the James-Lange theory, would be the same. Now, it's not very consistent with what we just talked about, because we're talking about, obviously, very different neurotransmitter systems. But we can forgive William James because he didn't know anything about neurotransmitters during his time. So we might have an anger situation that leads to this physiological state, and therefore we feel anger. We have the same distinct physiological state, but it's in a euphoric situation, so we feel euphoria. So it depends on what situation we're in and how we interpret it, how we interpret current events, as to how we feel about whatever that physiological state might be. So this leads to what we call the facial feedback hypothesis. The facial feedback hypothesis is that if our physical experiences are leading to our emotions, then we should be able to trigger an emotion with a physical experience. So basically the idea is that facial expressions can trigger the experience of emotions. And so this is a classic study. It's been done in a variety of ways. And the data is a little mixed, truth be told, about how this comes out. We'll kind of try to summarize it here in a bit. But basically they had participants hold a pencil in a couple different ways while reading cartoons or watching cartoons and rating how funny they were. So they either held the pen or pencil this way, which makes more of a smile, or this way, which makes more of a frown. Although frankly, I've tried to do this and I haven't been particularly successful. There's another way you can do this as well, but basically you end up with either a smile or a frown. People who are holding the pen or pencil this way found the cartoons funnier than those who were doing them this way. I should also note at this point that there are other areas of evidence consistent with this. People who have Botox injections. Basically, Botox, we have everybody with wrinkles here. Botox is injected into people's facial muscles so that they don't form facial expressions anymore, so that they don't look wrinkled. And there is data that says that those people do not experience emotion with the same intensity as they had prior to their Botox injection. So the Botox is actually potentially leading them to sort of lower levels of emotion. The next theory of emotions relates more to the cognitive component. This is what we call the two-factor theory. And essentially what's happening here is the physiological arousal determines the intensity of an emotion, and our cognitive interpretation then determines the type of emotion. So now we're getting a little bit more nuance in terms of how our physiological responses are associated with our emotional responses. If you're really interested in more about the brain and emotions, I have on YouTube an emotions in the brain lecture for my physiological psychology class that I'm teaching online this summer. So you can take a look at that. I'll try to remember to post it to Canvas, where I talk more about this kind of detail. But basically, this two-factor theory is we have some cognitive appraisal of what's happening with physiological arousal. The physiological arousal determines the level of the emotion, whereas the cognitive appraisal determines the type of emotion. So, low level of physiological arousal might be irritated. A high level of physiological arousal might be anger, that sort of thing. So now it's a little more nuanced in terms of how this all works together. There's some evidence for this as well. There is some very famous studies on what's called misattribution of arousal, where we can attach an emotional label to an ambiguous source of arousal. And the way this is done is essentially by inducing sort of a high, getting your stress system sort of highly involved. And so how this worked in this initial study, and there have been others similar to it, they have participants walk across a very sketchy, unstable bridge like this one. And so you have this participant walk across here, and then over here is a person who's going to ask them some questions. Turns out this early study was all male research participants with an attractive research assistant at the other end. They found that participants who had walked across this bridge versus other participants were much more likely to call the research assistant or ask for her phone number. There was several different ways in which this has been sort of looked at. But essentially, you get this what we call misattribution of arousal or excitation transfer. So that residual physiological arousal from walking across the sketchy suspension bridge is transferred to a new stimulus, to the research assistant. So they feel like because of that high level of physiological awareness, they then associate that with an emotion of attraction, which is transferred to the research assistant. One really important component of all of this has to do with our cognitive framing. The way we think about events helps to contribute to our emotional response. And in fact, there's an entire field of clinical psychology in cognitive behavioral therapy trying to get us to think differently about our feelings and our behavior than what we have in the past. So this cognitive framing is an important part of managing our emotional responses, which is what we're going to talk about next. So one important thing we can try to do and to keep ourselves as happy, healthy adults is to try to regulate our moods. And you get better at this with time. As I was saying earlier, one of the things that can happen is you can kind of spiral a bit because your mood brings up experiences that match your mood. Humor is a really great way to try to regulate your mood. It's a long, tried and true way of improving that. One of the best ways to improve your affect is to just watch a funny movie, try to do something funny. Helps boost your immune system. Laughter actually has been shown to actually boost your immune system and releases endorphins. Humor is a great way to try to help get you out of your mood. One thing you don't want to do is try to engage in either thought suppression or mood suppression. Is just simply not think about it, try to ignore it. Oftentimes that results in what we call a rebound effect. And in fact, you'll feel worse even later because now it's back again, and this again, and so suppression is not a good way to do it. Humor is a great way. The other thing I highly recommend is distraction. So we want to avoid suppression and rumination. Rumination is another mistake we can make. This is that spiraling problem we were talking about a moment ago. So you're depressed, then you start thinking about every person who's ever wronged you and how you're never going to be successful, and then you just spiral downward and downward, right? This kind of rumination is not good for you. I know I've been guilty of it on occasion. Sometimes I just want to wallow in it, right? I don't know. That's a bad thing to do. You have to come out from underneath the covers at some point and face life. Distraction is actually a really good technique, and this is where your friends kind of come in, or you as friends can come in and helping someone who's going through a tough time, is to just distract them, get them to do something else. A good way to avoid the problems of suppression and rumination. Again, so long as it's not maladaptive. You don't want to distract them with liquor and cocaine. That's not a good way. Nice trip down to the museum, go putt golfing, bowling, go to the gym, go running, go on a bike ride. Physical activity is very good. It helps improve mood, helps regulate your all sorts of things. So physical activity is always good, but any kind of activity. Go to the movies. Make sure it's a happy, fun, good movie, sad movie. Back at rumination. Kind of good, healthy distractions. Just get out and then try to enjoy the day. Any questions about that? I want to turn now and talk a little bit about the neurophysiological basis of emotion. We'll talk about how the autonomic nervous system is directly involved. Talk a little bit about the amygdala, the orbitofrontal cortex, cerebral asymmetry, and then finally, different neurotransmitters. And we should have some time to talk about the exam. So the autonomic nervous system, all of our emotions tend to overlap in our autonomic nervous system responses. We have actually a number of cues that are associated with our emotions. Unfortunately, some of them are a bit confusing. So our faces can flush if we're either angry, sexually aroused, of course embarrassed. I guess they can happen at the same time. People do have angry sex, right? I don't recommend that, but as long as everyone's consenting, I'm sure that's the issue. Anger, pupils are actually a really important social cue. Your pupils constrict when we get angry, and your pupils dilate when you are sexually attracted to someone. Actually, in the 1920s, women would put belladonna in their eyes, and belladonna is atropine, which is what your eye doctor uses to dilate your pupils. And so they would walk around with pupils like this, because people thought they would find that attractive. Drugs actually have some effects on pupils as well. Opioids tend to cause pupil constriction. Amphetamines, cocaine tend to cause pupils to dilate. These patterns of autonomic nervous system arousal are consistent similar across cultures, as they're associated with different moods. This is also, of course, the basis of polygraphs for lie detection. So what polygraphs do is they measure your heart rate, your blood pressure, your respiration, and what's called your galvanic skin response. And your galvanic skin response measures how much you are sweating, basically by how electrically conductive your skin is. In theory, this is supposed to allow the polygraph examiner to determine whether or not you are telling the truth or telling a lie. As I said, that's in theory. This is one of these areas where you get into this question of precision versus accuracy. So polygraphs are very precise. They're measuring all of these things exactly. Heart rate, galvanic skin response, all of that's precisely measured. Unfortunately, not very good at detecting lies. They're actually quite easy to fool. A couple of things that you can do that are associated with this, trying to fool lie detectors. There are drugs people take so they don't perspire. You can actually clench muscles to try to increase your galvanic skin response and increase your heart rate. Of course, some kind of crazy stuff. So they're not particularly valid, which is a problem. So the amygdala then is, of course, part of the limbic system. This is talked about in previous lectures. Limbic system is associated with memory, our sense of smell. So we have the amygdala, this little almond-shaped structure here connected to the hippocampus. We have the hypothalamus, also directly tied in with the amygdala. It's involved in a lot of our basic functions: thirst, hunger, sex, etc. The other thing that is directly tied in right here is our sense of smell, and our sense of smell tends to be tied in with our emotions and memory as well. So the amygdala processes incoming information in two different ways. We have a fast route and a slower route. The fast route is directly from the thalamus to the amygdala. The thalamus is our sensory switchboard. This is where our sight, vision directly intersect. It's the first stop in the brain. So we go directly from our sensory systems right to the amygdala. This tends to be things that are associated with very important information, like, oh, there's a snake, or oh, someone's trying to kill me. Very automatic, very sudden emotional responses. The slower route is more deliberative, where we get more cognitive evaluation of what's happening. This travels the full pathway through the thalamus, up to the sensory cortexes, then to the amygdala. And so this is where we get deliberative evaluation of the situation and what's happening. So as we start talking about our experience of emotions, this fast route is probably associated with very intense, high activation emotions. Surprise, for example, would probably be directly involved here. Things like, a sudden miss in a car accident is going to go this fast route and cause this sudden emotional response. You'll still get this slower route response that allows you to cognitively evaluate it, but the initial emotional response itself is going to be triggered by this fast route. We also know that damage to the amygdala can result in a lack of fear conditioning. Animals will no longer be afraid. People will actually also no longer be afraid. I want to insert kind of a note here. If you remember in the Memory Hackers video, one of the things that they were doing is when they eliminated fear. Sorry. I don't know. I didn't know we had a piano up here. So, you remember back to the memory hackers video when they were training that guy to not be afraid of spiders. This is where kind of I'm going to tie a few bits of what we've been talking about together. So, they managed to get rid of his fear conditioning to spiders by blocking norepinephrine and its connection with his memories. So remember, a few minutes ago, I talked about how those negative emotions like fear are associated with elevated levels of norepinephrine. Well, what they were able to do by using that drug propranolol is they were able to block that norepinephrine from being associated with his memory for the spider. So they were actually able to eliminate that emotional response to the spider by eliminating that connection with norepinephrine. It's kind of all ties together. So the orbitofrontal cortex is the other part of the brain that's particularly responsible for our emotional responses. Damage to the, well, of course, remember Phineas Gage, disconnecting the frontal lobes to the amygdala resulted in aggression, outbursts, inability to control, lack of rationality. Damage to the frontal lobes also have been associated with excessive aggression and violence, some loss of the emotional content of memories, and insensitivity to the emotional expressions of others. This can be particularly problematic for people with traumatic brain injury. We've seen in a number of cases, particularly war veterans coming home with head injuries, you can oftentimes see increases in domestic violence, increases in aggression, increases in suicidality. Part of that is sort of loss of this emotional content, inability to interact with others and understand the emotional expressions of others. So this is a really important part of understanding the entire experience of people who have something like a traumatic brain injury. And so this is one of those things you just have to be mindful of when we start talking with people who have that kind of injury. There is some neuroscience associated with cerebral asymmetry. People seem to show negative affect, these negative moods and emotions tend to be more right hemisphere, whereas positive emotions tend to be more left hemisphere. It's possible some of this is tied in with other cerebral asymmetry issues. So the right hemisphere tends to be more visual, tends to be more visual spatial. So it's possible that negative emotions are often associated with more visual content. Certainly violent memories. A lot of the negative studies about negative memories have more visual content, whereas positive emotions can be oftentimes more easily expressed in language, words, etc. And so, of course, language is more of a left hemisphere task. Finally, we're going to be done a little bit early today, but I want to answer questions about the exam. And that'll give you time then to review those couple of lectures that I posted for you if you haven't had time to do that. The neurotransmitters involved in emotion, in addition to, when we talked about dopamine and norepinephrine, the frontal lobe is heavily populated with neurons that respond to dopamine. We know patients who are on antipsychotic drugs, which cause decreases in dopamine levels, tend to show very flat affect. They have very little outward experience of emotion. And we also know that serotonin is associated with, in some way, mood. The lower levels of serotonin have been associated with diminished mood, for example, depression. Although our understanding of depression is evolving a great deal, it's a little bit overly simplistic to say that people who have depression have lower levels of serotonin. There's a lot more to it than that. We do know that boosting serotonin levels can improve mood. Some drugs, some recreational drugs like ecstasy are certainly associated with high levels. Ecstasy is associated with high levels of serotonin, which are associated with high levels of sort of euphoria, tend to get very touchy-feely on ecstasy, I guess is the best way to put that. And so these two neurotransmitters certainly are involved in mood and emotion. And this is way earlier than I thought we would get through all of that. But what questions do you have about the exam? Remember, there's a motivation lecture and a language lecture I tell you to do online. Those are posted. Make sure you take a look at those. The exam will cover everything we've covered since the last exam.